An extract from a short story by Mervyn Rowell, They Also Serve. It concerns a middle-aged man, Mr. Carmody, who has been unemployed for some time. He has an appointment to meet a contact of his in the civil service, Mr. Watkins, to inquire about a job. Mr. Carmody sat down again and, resting his head between his hands, went on with his reading. He was re-perusing section 23, which was not at all clear, when the trampling of feet and an occasional crash informed him that government furniture was once more being moved. He continued to read until the sounds of activity came to the corridor outside. He listened for a while, and then, as he was getting anxious lest Mr. Watkins had indeed forgotten him, he went over again and opened the door. Workmen were moving tables into the room next to his. An official stood alongside with a piece of paper and a red pencil in his hand. A workman came down the passage carrying a pile of papers. "Arts and craft stuff," he said. "Right," said the official. "Bring them in." "What about the end room?" asked another. "Is there anything to go in there?" The official read the number over Mr. Carmody's head, 107, and he consulted his list. "No, we're not getting 107. Internal affairs must be moving in there." "That's all then?" asked the first workman. "That's all," said the official, and without as much as a glance at Mr. Carmody, they all went down the corridor. For a few minutes, Mr. Carmody stood in the doorway. Then he stepped back into the room. "That's queer," he said to himself. "This room is not on the internal affairs list and not on the arts and crafts list, and each of them thinks it belongs to the other department." It was growing late in the afternoon. The room was no longer light. Soon it would be half dark. He knew suddenly that Mr. Watkins must have forgotten the appointment, and that the right thing for him to do was to go away and call tomorrow at the new offices, wherever they were. But he found he was unwilling to go. His heart sickened when he thought of having to go out again into the chill of the city. The thought of the misery of his position, the heartbreaking search for a job, any job at all, and the interviews with successful, patronizing men, which were such a hurt to his shyness and his pride. "I'll stay here till 5 when they all go," he said to himself. "At least there are hot pipes." To be continued. He got up and groped for the light switch. He took off his overcoat and hung it behind the door. Then he seated himself at the table again with his head in his hands and forced himself to go on with his reading. He was surprised by a quick step in the passage and a knock at the door. A young man came in. "Good evening," he said briskly, laying on the table what seemed to be a list of names. "I hardly know where I am with all this moving about of stuff. What's your name, please?" Mr. Carmody told him, and the young man added the name quickly to the list. "I'll be around on the 31st about 11, he said. "You'll be here about that time, I suppose?" "Here," said Mr. Carmody. "Yes, at 11 on Friday the 31st, in this room." "Oh, you're from Mr. Watkins." "No," replied the young man, looking puzzled. "From Mr. O'Brien." "Oh," said Mr. Carmody, not understanding a word. "I'll always be here at 11, said the young man. "Good evening," and he went out briskly, leaving Mr. Carmody gasping after him in astonishment. On Friday at 11 o'clock, Mr. Carmody sat in the room at the end of the corridor, waiting for the young man to arrive. He did not understand why he was to be there, but he believed it was all connected in some way with the original appointment made by Mr. Watkins. The room was unchanged. The table was still littered with abandoned papers. At 11:05, the young man came in, brisk as before, with a bundle of paper slips in his hand. "Good morning," he said. "Awful work we have in finance. What with the change of government and the staffs moving round all the city. Your name is—" "Carmody," said the other, wondering what was going to happen next. "Benedict Carmody," said the young man, selecting a slip of paper from his bundle and laying it on the table. "I'll be here at the same time on the last day of the month. Good morning." When the door closed, Mr. Carmody gazed at amazement at the slip of paper. It was headed Department of Internal Affairs, and it was a cheque for £30. Mr. Carmody has now been in occupation of the little room for 17 years. He comes in every morning about 11:15 and reads the newspaper. Then he looks at the ceiling and smokes cigarettes through a long holder until lunchtime. He is very rarely disturbed, however, since in his second year he wrote "private" on a sheet of paper and pasted it on the door. He feels himself perfectly secure, as the officials of each department, no doubt, imagine he belongs to the other one whenever they chance to see him in the passages, that is, if they think about him at all. In the afternoon, he usually goes for a stroll or sits in one of the city parks until the evening editions of the newspapers come out. Sometimes he takes a week or a fortnight's holiday, but he's always careful to be back on the last day of the month to receive a brisk young man with a bundle of cheques. He has 6 years to run before he reaches retiring age. He's beginning to wonder about whether they will give him a pension.
Patricia Craig has written an assessment of the Fursey novels, and she's going to read that now. Patricia's a native of Belfast and has written many books, including a biography of Brian Moore, a study of Elizabeth Bowen, but she's edited shelffuls of books. The Ulster Anthology, the Oxford Book of Ireland, the Oxford Book of Detective Stories, the Penguin Book of British Comic Writing, and many, many more. Her latest book is entitled Bookworm, a memoir of childhood reading, and it was published just a few weeks ago, so it's now coming in, it's in the shops and can be bought, and it's really an account, a very moving account of her reading as a teenager and the books that helped shape her imagination. Patricia Craig.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that very nice introduction. When I was 16 or 17 and a schoolgirl in Belfast, the father of a friend drew my attention to the 2 Fursey novels by Mervyn Rowell. I'm still grateful to him because I might otherwise have missed them, and that would have been missing a treat. I don't know if I'd have picked up the dedicated satirical age on a first reading, but once I'd wiped the tears of laughter out of my eyes and emerged exhilarated from Wall's inspired medieval Irish caper, I began to understand that a serious purpose underlay the novel's comic brio and inventiveness. The unfortunate Fursey and the return of Fursey are products of an enlightened social awareness and dissenting impulse. They are also prescient. The emphasis on clerical zealotry struck a progressive note at the time, and indeed in mid-20th century Ireland there was a large amount of churchly corruption, chicanery and repression of the populace for Wall to get his teeth into, a larger amount than many of us realised. As he says at one point in the second book, I quote, "Fursey knew that wherever there was strong religious conviction, there was bloodletting and oppression, and never mind whether it's medieval or modern Catholicism that's in question, 17th century Puritanism, Islamist supremacism, paganism, or whatever." When I edited the Oxford Book of Ireland, which was published in 1998, I included a couple of extracts from the unfortunate Percy in the section entitled Puritan Ireland, and in the introduction to that anthology, complaining bitterly about the effect of De Valera, Archbishop McQuaid and their ilk on the atmosphere in the country, I remarked that fortunately there were always writers who resisted the lure of Irish Catholic blandness and complacency. I was thinking, I say, of Flann O'Brien, of poets such as Austin Clarke and Patrick Kavanagh, of the novelist Mervyn Wall, of the staff and contributors to Ireland's most adventurous periodical of the 1940s, The Bell, an entire group we might call the O'Whalan dissentients. All these, I go on, by engaging energetically and sometimes enigmatically in social criticism, place themselves in a line of incomparable Irish writing which stretches back through Joyce and George Moore to the County Tyrone novelist William Carleton. Mervyn Wall's Percy is an outstanding example of the little man in fiction, the innocent person who undergoes incessant alarms and plagues and agitations through no fault of his own. He first appears as a lay monk of small intellect. As Wall puts it, Percy possessed the virtue of holy simplicity in such a high degree that he was considered unfit for any work other than paring edible roots in the monastery kitchen. Harmless and hopeless though he is, Brother Percy has attracted the attentions of a whole host of demons, wraiths, griffins, poltergeists, and other devilish manifestations who've taken up residence in his cell at Clonmacnoise. It isn't long before the unfortunate Percy is expelled from the monastery, for the good of the community, of course, and left sitting disconsolately on the side of a heathery hill. What follows is a rapid escalation of the enormities by which he is beset. Inadvertently becoming a sorcerer, and incidentally acquiring a lot more wit than he started out with, this is for Percy only the start of it. The persecution of Wall's eponymous innocent reaches a kind of apex in Percy's betrayal by his reverent father figure, the abbot of Clonmacnoise, who sneakily packs the ex-monk off to be burnt at the stake, a common sorcerer's fate which the not-so-unfortunate Percy evades more than once in the course of the narrative. Before this, at the start of chapter 2, we've encountered the first of Mervyn Wall's primary targets, the well-named Father Furiosus, a wandering friar of whom we read, "He was a man of powerful frame, and you had but to observe the great knotted fist clutching a heavy blackthorn stick, to have it borne in powerfully upon you that the church militant was no empty phrase." Father Furiosus and his colleague Bishop Flanagan, occupier of a fine new mansion which boasts the first upstairs in Ireland, are very hot on the need to assert at all times and in all things the superiority of the church to the state. I can't resist an aside here. The friar going down on his knees to kiss the bishop's ring calls to mind the shocking image which appeared somewhere recently of De Valera on his knees kissing the ring of Archbishop McQuaid. With the Percy novels, Mervyn Wall has arrived at a perfect way to pillory targets such as these, placing them in the thick of exorbitant goings-on while keeping a light touch and a clear head. The light touch extends to his coverage of the dark arts, and I take it that the lively parade of sorcerers, magicians, witches, alchemists, and so forth is meant to represent the wayward outsiders in Irish society, all those subject to anti-clerical ideas, creative non-conformity, or individualist impulses. As for Satan himself, who seems to have a soft spot for Percy, he's an urbane and intriguing gentleman who comes out of Wall's engaging imbroglio rather better than his churchly adversaries. Shades of Paradise Lost here, perhaps. There's a hilarious but telling episode towards the end of the first book, when Wall's arch-fiend makes a bargain with the clergy of Ireland. Which is the greatest of all sins, he demands of an embarrassed Father Furiosus, who, after some humming and hawing, comes out with an answer. The most hideous of all crimes are those which may be summed up by the word sex. Exactly, says Satan, and offers to confer on the whole country immunity from temptation in this respect, in return for a promise from the church elders not to make too much of such minor sins as simony, drunkenness, nepotism, perjury, and murder. The friars and bishops readily agree to this condition, thinking they've got the best of the bargain, which brings about a state of affairs stretching away and away into the future, summed up by Paul Blanchard in his book The Irish and Catholic Power, which was published some years after the Percy novels. The total sexual expression of the Irish people, Blanchard wrote in 1954, is much less than it is in other countries. The Catholic crusade against normal sexual life has actually created a nation of men and women who try to drown their fundamental instincts. Or, as an indignant Percy has it in Book 2, when Satan wants to know if the ex-monk's association with an amiable young woman called Maeve has actually been consummated. Certainly not. We both had a good Irish Catholic upbringing and we don't know how. I'm reminded of Dermot Ferreter's recent monumental study of sex and society in modern Ireland, Occasions of Sin, when he says that it took until the 1990s for Ireland to carnally come of age. Quite so. In the unfortunate Percy, at the end of the negotiations between the devil and the church diehards, a gleeful Satan confides to Percy, "Unless my sense of humour has again betrayed me, I appear to have the souls of the Irish clergy in my bag for all time. It'll give hell a considerable Irish ecclesiastical character, and I suppose the other damned won't like it. Before long, hell will hardly know itself. It will bear an extraordinary resemblance to an annual general meeting of the Catholic Truth Society." I can't imagine that quips such as this would have gone down well with the humourless and inflated Irish clergy of the time. I don't know if Mervyn Wall actually ever fell foul of the censorship board, but this unspeakable and backward institution is fair game for his satirical attentions. In The Return of Percy, the Synod of Cashel has appointed a censor whose task is to visit every monastery in Ireland and search the libraries for written matter offensive to morals. The censor is described as a small dark man with a subhuman cast of countenance. "I've an old mother," he explains to one outraged librarian desperately trying to hold on to his Greek and Latin manuscripts, his Metamorphoses, his invaluable copies of the Old Testament. "I've an old mother," says the censor, "who lives in a cottage on the slopes of the McGillicuddy Reeks. She is for me the type of the decent, clean-minded people of Ireland. Whenever I'm in doubt about a word or a phrase, I ask myself, would such a word or a phrase be used by her?" "Can your mother read?" demands the beleaguered librarian through gritted teeth. "No," comes the answer, "she's illiterate, but I don't see what difference that makes." Sometime later, we find a wise old crystal gazer in conversation with Percy. "In the eyes of the established authority," he says, "the one unforgivable sin is to have an original and inquiring mind." Ideas, that's what they're afraid of. Ideas and women. The Irish attitude to women is another of the social abuses at which the avant-garde author pokes enlivening fun. One character I wish there'd been more of is Albert. Percy's familiar with the bare paws, who clearly owes something to the irascible Samyad in E. Nesbitt's book of related stories, Five Children and It. Albert is permanently aggrieved and not without cause. He's attached to a sorcerer who refuses to fulfill his obligations. Though, as a consequence of all the tribulations he is forced to undergo, Percy at one point assures Albert, "I am resolved to live a life of unexampled depravity." In fact, he can't do it, though he tries, because it isn't in his nature. Neither is it in his nature to be a husband. At the end of the first book, Having for once taken matters into his own hands, Fursey flies off on a broomstick, accompanied by the young woman, Maeve, on whom, in his own words, he is sore assotted. The end of the second book, though, sees him plodding gamely on his own along the road to Cashel, as the author rises to a fine elegiac ending to his saga. I quote, "Last spring I walked the road from Clonmacnoise to Cashel and from Cashel to the Gap. Fursey and the others are still there, trampled into the earth of road and field these 1,000 years." The change of tone is perfectly appropriate, the whole feeling of the novels perfectly judged. What they add up to is an eloquent and entertaining plea for tolerance, the holy ground of tolerance, which is going against the grain of contemporary Ireland with its firm footing in this or that ground and its battlegrounds. The Unfortunate Fursey, with its sequel, makes an audacious and illuminating departure on the part of a resident witness. Thank you.
An extract from The Unfortunate Fursey, a novel by Mervyn Rowell. Brother Fursey, a medieval monk of lowly rank, has been expelled from Clonmacnoise. He has had many adventures in the supernatural, many of them related to the threat of his own immolation. On his way to Cashel to hand himself into the authorities, he meets a hermit who gives him temporary refuge. "Let us return thanks before retiring to rest," said the holy man, sinking on his knees. The hermit prayed for almost an hour in a loud and terrible voice, accusing himself and Fursey of all the known sins and imploring forgiveness, while Fursey on his knees slumbered fitfully. When the hermit had brought his orisons to a conclusion in a final wallow of abnegation, he directed Fursey's attention to a neat row of disciplines hanging on the wall. There were about a dozen, and they varied in size from a narrow, lithe whip to a broad leather thong in which were embedded a goodly number of nails and shark's teeth. "We must do a little penance before we retire," said the hermit, "a couple of dozen lashes apiece. We can confer them one upon another." "Oh, I always do my penance in the morning," replied Fursey hurriedly. "You might be dead before the morning," urged the hermit, "and you will have lost this opportunity of acquiring grace." "I'll risk it," said Fursey stoutly. "Morning is my time for mortifying myself, and I'm not going to break the good habit of a lifetime." "Oh, have it your own way," answered the hermit huffily. "I'm not going to forego my nightly mortification of the flesh. Oblige me by giving me 20 lashes." An odour of sanctity swept across the cavern like a wave as the holy man peered off his upper garment and took up his stand, stripped to the waist with his back to Fursey. Fursey inspected the row of disciplines. "What size would you like?" he asked. "One of medium strength," replied the hermit. Fursey examined the row of disciplines judiciously. Then he turned and looked at the hermit's back. A sudden image had come into his mind, a picture of the unfortunate Albert lying at the bottom of the moorland pool. "I venture to suggest," said Fursey, "that the thick hair with which your back is draped affords you considerable protection against a discipline of medium weight. In a holy matter such as this, you must play fair with God. I suggest a discipline of greater striking power." "Use your judgment," said the hermit testily, and turned away once more. He hunched his back to meet the blow. Fursey picked down the weightiest discipline and tested the shark's teeth and nails with his thumb. Then he rolled up his sleeves and let fly with all his strength a resounding smack and wound twice round the holy man's body. The gentle anchorite emitted a howl and capered madly up and down the cave. "What's wrong?" asked Fursey. "You told me to hit you." "I didn't tell you to take the skin off the flesh and my bones," gasped the anchorite, turning on Fursey, eyes full of bale. I'll use another discipline for the remaining 19 strokes, replied Fursey comfortingly. There's a nice one here with broken bits of razor embedded in the leather. Oh, I've had enough for tonight, muttered the hermit between his teeth. Already I can feel my soul suffused and flooded with sanctifying grace. But in the morning, and his eyes met Fursey's, I'll have the remaining 19 when you are having your 20. We shall confer them one on another. This is the most convenient. Certainly, agreed Fursey, quickly making up his mind that he would be gone before the morning. The anchorite was still squirming as he indicated a heap of foul-smelling straw in the corner, which was to be their bed. He laid himself gingerly on his face as his back seemed to be still sore, and Fursey stretched himself alongside. Before long, the cave was shrill with the hermit's catarrhal snores, which forced their way through his beard in a muffled whistle. Hour after hour, Fursey tossed on the straw, unable to sleep. When a man of determined sanctity has lived in a small cave for 40 years, the insect life is apt to assume alarming proportions. Bugs, resigned for many years to the thin diet which the hermit's skinny fame provided, after one nip at Fursey, scuttled off to tell their friends, and soon all the game in the cavern were making in his direction. They came in such myriads that for a moment Fursey thought that an attempt was being made to murder him. Plump fleas investigated different parts of his body in a series of gargantuan hops, while great strapping bugs fastened themselves to his arms and thighs. The smaller fry of the insect world, mites and the like, contented themselves with setting up colonies in unlikely corners of his anatomy where the competition was less keen. Fursey rolled and wallowed, but to no avail. To add to his discomfort, the gentle anchorite woke up and seemed not only jealous of the attention his vermin were paying to Fursey, but to fear that there was a real danger of losing the external evidence of his 40 years' sanctity. So he bent over from time to time to collect as many bugs as he could from Fursey's body and put them back on his own. This preposterous behaviour Fursey found in the highest degree exasperating. You couldn't possibly sleep if you were turned over every half an hour by your host and searched.
Val Mulkerns is best known as a novelist and short story writer, but she began as a columnist and journalist. She was a theatre critic and associate editor of that hugely influential journal, The Bell, when it was under the editorship of Padder O'Donnell. Her books include Antiquities, The Summer House, Very Like a Whale. She was a regular broadcaster on Sunday Miscellany and is a member of Ace Dorna. She has written a memoir, Friends of the Enemy, which I hope before too long will be on the bookshelves. Val Mulkerns.
Thank you, everybody. On the last day, I visited Mervyn. He took me upstairs to his study, book-walled, and he showed me the number of books which he had reread. And there were certainly far more there in 2.5 shelves, tightly packed shelves, than what remained to be read. So I never actually learned whether he finished all those books, but I strongly suspect that he did. He was a fairly determined person, Mervyn. Now, he knew things that the rest of us didn't know. He knew, for instance, that Eamon de Valera sometimes held cabinet meetings on the train between Dublin and Galway. And he knew that these were conducted in Irish, except when there was a pause and it was pointed out, now I am going to turn to English because this is something important I don't want to say. Now, how Mervyn knew this, nobody ever asked him, because you wouldn't tell you. I mean, his sources would be as protected as those of a journalist, you know. But sometimes he would give you a collection of things to bring home with you, in your head, that is. And one was, I remember well, that in every garden there should be a place where children can hide. And this was, I remember this when, during a spell of marvellous weather, Mervyn's 80th birthday party was held in his own garden, that garden. And well enough, he had a little sort of a little tunnel, I suppose, and this was the essential place where children could hide. And indeed they did, because there were some children there at the party, and occasionally they vanished. Where but into the little tunnel. So I'm not sure that anybody else could get so far inside the head of a child as to regard this as a necessity, you know, to give him somewhere to hide out of the way. Mervyn ended up in the same nursing home as Fanny, his wife. And I think one of the first things he must have done was made an appointment with her hairdresser for a weekly visit, because Fanny wouldn't like to be deprived of her weekly visit to the hairdresser, so the hairdresser came to her. So there was something extremely interesting about this man, who wrote wonderful comic books, and at a time when really there was nothing of that nature but Miles and Gopleen in the Irish Times, and even so it was a different kind of humour, you know. And I have no doubt at all that if he had lived a bit longer, he would have produced something to merit standing beside the Fursey books. That was a pity, I think. The short story which you have heard tonight is an example of the drollness of the man's mind, and the fact that he he was a civil servant for most of his life, and there's something about this, the mood in that last room along the corridor, where somebody comes every week and gives him this cheque, on which he lives, of course. So Mervyn, as a writer, is one of the very few truly comic writers that we have. And I think he's to be treasured, and I believe that there have been reprints of some of the funniest of his books, and it gives everybody an opportunity, now that they are in print again, to read them. I think he would be greatly amused by the size of you, the audience here tonight, because to him, I think his books were just a normal gait of going. They were, you know, he didn't think them particularly funny, I would imagine, although I never questioned about this, of course. But very few people would have made out of boring, what most people would regard as a boring civil service job, could have used the material to such marvellously comic effect. And now that they're in print, some of them again, I hope we can all read them and laugh all over again at the jokes of Mervyn. Thank you very much.
An extract from Leaves for the Burning, a novel by Mervyn Wall. Lucian is a minor civil servant of middle age who has been banished to a county council sub-office in a sleepy town in the fictional county of Moymel. Lucian's place of work was a single room which the county council rented from the owner of a bicycle repair shop. The chief disadvantage of the office, however, was a far door opening into a yard in which the landlord kept a pig and some emaciated poultry. The bicycle man, his wife and 5 children, his brother-in-law and a dog, all considered that they had a right of way, so that there was a constant coming and going all day long. Each year for 10 years, on the final day of January, Lucian had addressed a minute to his headquarters in Moymel, the county town, calling attention to the state of the premises. A reply came invariably to hand sometime in February, to the effect that the matter was being accorded attention. Lucian entered the office. He saw his one assistant, Willie Whitlow, bent over a newspaper in the corner. "Good morning," he said, as he hung up his hat and coat on a nail driven into one of the shelves. "Any news in the paper?" Willie Whitlow turned his head, a bald head, thinly sprinkled with a few surviving grey hairs. He was a little pidge-widgeon of a fellow, whom one might guess to be any age, possibly 60. His pale blue eyes fixed themselves expressionlessly on Lucian's face. "News in the paper?" he echoed tonelessly. "You can have it. I can't see the print. It keeps jumping up and down." "Bad night?" "Woeful." The reply came from the old man in an indistinct mumble. "I was over at the Godly Publicans. I'll have to give that place up. The drink they serve you makes your toes open and shut, but I'm getting too old for it." "Ah, you must be bad. Can you see nothing in the paper at all?" I can see the headlines. Well, what do they say? The usual. De Valera condemns new government. Bishop denounces mixed bathing. Irishman tries to hang his mother. Latest from Newmarket. No news of the Yates funeral? Not the queer things you'll be interested in. Should that be in the small print? You'll have to find it for yourself. He put the newspaper in a crumpled heap on Lucian's table and went slowly across to the counter to open the morning's Post. As he moved with shuffling steps, he kept his right shoulder raised and stiff. Ah, you're bad, Willie. I see you've got the rat squatting on your shoulder again. Aye, blast him. If I disturb him, he'll bite me. Why don't you pull yourself together, man, and tell yourself there's no rat? I know it doesn't make sense, but he's there all the same. Haven't you got a looking glass in that place you're staying in? Why don't you stand in front of it and see that there's no rat? I'd be afraid of the fright it'd give me if I was to see him. Were you late over in the pub? He asked. Willie sucked for a moment at his toothless gums. I hear someone saying at one stage that it was 3:30, but we were there after that. We were there until some of the lads started singing the Adeste Fidelis. That horrified the godly publican so much that he put it all out. It's a wonder you go to such a low dive. It wasn't that nor the religious whiskey either that killed me, answered Willie mistily. When I did get home, I got no sleep. There were smugglers driving cattle through the town all night on their way north to the border. The bloody animals were lowing and mooing under my window all the night. Did you not hear them yourself? No, replied Lucian. I slept heavily. How do you know they were smugglers? Willie Whitlow turned a face, vague with surprise. Sure, the customs man who shares the room with me had his head out of the window half the night cursing at them. He told me. He should know. It's his job. But why wasn't he out arresting them? Why should he? He's off duty at 5 o'clock.
Our last speaker is Dr. Maurice Harmon. He is the Professor Emeritus of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at UCD. He's a distinguished and respected critic, biographer, literary historian and poet. And he has held visiting professorships in United States, universities in the United States, in continental Europe and Japan. He's written very deeply and well about various contemporaries of Mervyn Wall, such as Austin Clarke, Sean Fuelon, Benedict Kiley, Mary Lavin, Samuel Beckett. But tonight he's going to talk about his memories of Mervyn Wall. Dr. Harmon.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. I won't tell them that you were a student of mine one time. I knew Mervyn Wall when he looked like that, and liked his company very much. He was a formal and correct person, very well mannered. You could depend on him in any situation to say and do the right thing. He was also reserved, and but he was gently spoken, a quietly spoken man, but had a dry sense of humour, and this could come out at various times. I knew him when he was secretary of the Arts Council, and always found him to be an accessible person. He didn't need an appointment, he just turned up at the door, and the secretary phoned into him, and he came out very soon, quietly, always simple and direct in his way of dealing with you. There wasn't much money at stake in those days in the Arts Council. So Mervyn advised you on how to proceed if you were trying to get a grant for something. Listened patiently to you. And it was always quite a pleasant experience. But occasionally there could be the odd barb thrown in that took you by surprise. On one occasion, he asked me casually about a colleague, and in a sudden burst of, let's say, enthusiasm, I spoke rather strongly about him. And Mervyn commented dryly, "I didn't realise you felt so strongly about it." And I felt I had been walked into some kind of trap. He was a regular dinner guest, always good company, enjoyed food and drink, and then in later years he developed gout. So he'd always explain to you very carefully when he arrived that the doctor had diagnosed that he had gout. He could not take whiskey, but he could take wine. Didn't want you to forget that. Kind of man who knew everybody. He'd been at UCD in the 30s with people like Mary Lavin, Flann O'Brien, Dennis Devlin, Brian Coffey, Roger McHugh, and lots of other people. He and Mary Lavin were frequently guests in our house. Both were great talkers, and it was interesting to see them together around the table, swapping yarns and anecdotes. And Mary, of course, was a fierce talker. You could hardly get a word in. And Mervyn tended to listen to her. It was part of his courtesy of manner. Didn't try to overrule a woman guest, but he kept himself back from the conversation. The McHughs gave a Christmas party and everybody was there. You met all kinds of people. Began about 5 o'clock in the evening, went on all through the night into some early hour of the morning. And you met civil servants, politicians, diplomats, writers, artists, businessmen, a whole collection of people. And it began about 5 o'clock in the evening. You'd go for an early session or come in any time you liked. And then one Christmas, McHugh's didn't give a party. And Garth Fitzgerald complained. He had no place to go that year. So the Walls, Mervyn and Fanny, threw a Christmas party. And it was a wonderful occasion also. One year, Mervyn had the great honour, as he felt it to be invited to address the American Committee for Irish Studies. He prepared a witty speech, and you had to speak at dinner time during the conference, and Fanny felt it was too long for a dinner speech and persuaded Mervyn to let me read it to see if I could shorten it. So I took it and went through it and suggested a few changes. Of course, he didn't take any advice whatsoever. And he was hugely successful. Went on forever, but people loved it. They'd never heard him before, seen it before. He had that wonderful anecdotal manner and could entertain them wittily, and so he just carried off everything. And he never said anything to me, but I knew he felt that, haha, I've taught you something, Harmon. He was working on a novel. All the years I knew him, seemed to be working on his novel. But he told me one time that he never knew what was going to happen in the novel next. And he kind of moved along blindly, feeling his way. And he finally produced a big book called The Hermitage. And again, Fanny thought it was too big. People wouldn't like it. So persuaded him once again to get me to read it. This time I was rather careful, because reading another man's work is not the smartest thing in the world to do. But I took the manuscript home with me, read it carefully, made notes and so on, then went back out to the house. And Mervyn met me at the door, welcomed me, ushered me in, took me into the study, a lovely book-lined study, as Fanny has, as Val has said. And I went through my little piece carefully, calmly, and he didn't say anything. He seemed to accept everything as a matter of fact, nothing to worry about. And so, and he saw me out to the door when I was finished. And well, I said at the door that wasn't too bad after all. And he said, would like a kind of earthquake to me. And closed the door. So I went home. During Sean O'Phelan's final years, he and I used to meet regularly. usually at the Collymore Hotel beside the Collymore Harbour. We'd sit looking out at the sea and talk about various things, including Mervyn Wall, who had been his secretary when he was director of the Arts Council. And clearly he liked the man, had a good feeling about him. So I talked to Mervyn. I said, would you not go out and see Sean of Whalon? I think he's lonely and he'd love to see you. And Mervyn was clear about how he felt. He said, Sean of Whalon is a proud man, and I know he wouldn't like to see me in the way he is now. And so he never went. And I've never known from that day to this if that was a wise decision or not. Should he have gone, should he not have gone? When my life of Sean of Whalon was published in 1994, I came back from America to do some publicity shots, interviews and so on. And by then Mervyn was in a home. I went to see him. We had a lovely occasion chatting about old times and allowing our feelings to be present. But when he died in 1997, and I was away in Japan, and when he died I felt there was a kind of lack in my life. And I remember contacting Jonathan Williams. I said, if I send you not a telegram but something else by computer, would you send it to the Irish Times? So I wrote a letter to the Irish Times saying how sorry I was this man was finally gone. It's been a privilege to talk about him. I liked him very much as a man. I liked Fanny, his wife. We had many good times together. One time I was trying to get information on this because I can't place it exactly. She was being honoured, I think, by the National Concert Hall. And it was one of those occasions when it was all candlelit on stage and so on. And she was very excited. They wanted us to be with them, and of course we gladly did. But I've never quite remembered what it was that she was honoured for. I suppose for her work as a music critic. She, did many reviews in the Irish Times. Mervyn was anecdotal, sometimes witty and sometimes rather risque in his anecdotes. He told the most hair-raising kind of anecdotes. I couldn't repeat them. But a lovely man, and I'm very pleased to have the chance to say these few words about him. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. I wonder if the four speakers could go onto the chairs, and maybe this is your opportunity to ask questions, if you'd like, or make observations, anything about Mervyn Wall or his work. So just open it to the audience here tonight. Does anybody have a question or an observation?
I have a thought or two to add to what Maurice Harmon said. I saw a good deal of Mervyn Wall during the 1960s, which was a controversial time for the arts because of the Rusk exhibitions, the first of which was held in 1967 and the second was held in 1971. And they were controversial because the Arts Council director, Father Donald O'Sullivan, excluded Irish artists from being considered for Rusk, and nobody quite knew what to do. At least I knew what to do, and a colleague of mine who was art critic for the Irish Press knew what to do, and the pair of us used to go and visit Mervyn Wall, and with his impeccable and polite manners he always answered our questions, and we went away and wrote articles that were highly critical of the Arts Council and of its chairman, Father Donald O'Sullivan. And the more he became enraged, the more, I think, quietly in his own way, Mervyn Wall became relieved that he was unloading on our shoulders the opprobrium of raising criticisms, and the criticisms had quite an impact and changed the attitude of the organisers of Rusk, so that in due course there were Irish artists included in collateral exhibitions. But it wasn't a happy time for the arts, and the only people who got fun out of it, I think, were myself and my colleague in the other newspaper. Other critics failed to follow our lead, and we were isolated and enjoyed that isolation enormously. So I never went to Mervyn looking for money. I went looking for information, and he was open and free and generous about it always, and I became a friend of his. I was already a friend of Fanny's. I often met her before she went to the nursing home at recitals and talked to her about music. And it so happened that I became the carer for an elderly lady who had treated me as her child when I was a small boy, and she then fell on hard times, and I brought her to the same nursing home that Fanny was in when she had her difficulties, which included a paralysis which required her to be on a special rocking bed, and I used to stop and talk to her before going in to see my friend there. So I knew Fanny and Mervyn well, and in the same way, being fond of both of them and finding an impeccable truthfulness and straightforwardness in both of them, both in Fanny's criticism and in Mervyn's discussions about the people he served in the Arts Council. And he served them in absolute fairness and in a manner friendly towards their critics, which is not common in Irish life. Years later, I made a film, and at the end of making the film, I found that I had 3 professional tapes left over. They were quite expensive tapes used for television documentaries. And I said to my 2 cameramen, "What are we going to do with these tapes?" And they said, "Well, you know the people around here. Who would you like to film?" So I said, there are 2 people I'd like to film. One is Robert Greeson, and the other is Mervyn Wall. And so we hauled them in to my garden during a summer afternoon of sunshine and showers, and we sat them down and filmed them, and I asked them questions. And during the course of the interview with Mervyn Wall, he talked about his early visits to Germany. He went to Germany when he was young, and he was there in, I think, 1922 and 23, when the hyperinflation took place. And he was used to going to Germany and changing £1 sterling for 20 Deutschmarks. And he found on these years that he could buy 9,000 Deutschmarks for £1. And of course he couldn't buy very much with the 9,000, but it made him feel wealthy to carry these huge bundles of notes around him in his pockets. The film is a rough cut. That's all I have seen of it. It's going to be rescued and turned into a proper picture of Mervyn. But in it he talks about his writing, and he talks about the poets that influenced him and that he read, and he talks about his life in the Arts Council, the fact that his father was able to live the whole of his life without working because of money that he had inherited, and this gave Mervyn a comfortable background as a young man, as a boy and as a young man, and on through his life. But he was a meticulous civil servant, and I remember with pleasure going to the offices of the Arts Council, which wouldn't otherwise have attracted my attention or my presence, except that Mervyn was a stalwart believer in telling the truth and in telling what he was free to tell in the experience he had dealing with a difficult council that was doing things that Tony Butler, the other critic who worked with me and myself, found obnoxious and dishonest. And I think Mervyn would look at us and he would agree without saying anything that breached his position as a civil servant. I also looked at the other film about Robert Greeson, who was of Mervyn's contemporary and a poet that I admired greatly, and that film also contains a wonderful element of truth, tracing through the lives of civil servants at that time. A very different picture from the one gets now. Thank you.
Yeah, just a very small memory of Mervyn, nothing quite as elaborate as all you have said before, but I don't know, some of you may have been there, but in the 80s I was director of Poetry Ireland, and we obtained at that time, it's since gone to UCD unfortunately, the library of the late Austin Clarke. Now, Dardis Clarke, who is the son of Austin, well, we put him in charge of finding somebody to unveil the plaque, and we went down to Stony Batter and had a civil servicey kind of occasion. Did you miss that one? Did you?
I think I was there at Stony Batter.
Stony Batter. Yeah. Okay. Lovely. I'm sure you were, Jonathan. But anyway, we went. I had dealings with Dunleary County Council, I think, for some reason or other, where the people who gave permission for plaques resided at that time. It may have been, it wasn't Mr. Nicholson there, I see, who may have had a connection with the same place. But anyway, but it was quite funny, because what went on was that you get permission from the people of the house who own the house to put it up. They gave it. We had to fill in things, sort of, who was Austin Clarke, all the rest of it. Was he a poet? What did he write? All this sort of thing. You filled in a form and you sent it off. And then, of course, they said, we'd love to do this. And then nothing happened. About 6 months later, the phone rings and says, we want to put the plaque up on Friday. Are you free or something? So I had to organise it very quickly, and we got a lot of people, and we came along, and Dardis got Mervyn. Now, Mervyn just said all those characteristics that people have talked about. He was extremely mannerly. He was elderly then, and I called for him in my car with somebody else who's a friend of his. And we took him there, and he gave a very, very good little explanation about Austin, of which I remember absolutely nothing. But I do remember that he was a extremely charming, and that all those qualities of sort of dry wit, all the rest of it. And there was always, I had a feeling with Mervyn, which is wonderful. This is a wonderful picture, because if you notice the treasury tag going through there, yes, there's a real touch there. So that's just another little memory which bears out what everybody's saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought the Carmody story was rather Kafka-esque. Would you have been aware of Kafka, or was Kafka in translation at that time?
It's saying that the Carmody story, for the first story, was rather Kafkaesque, and would Mervyn have had much knowledge of Kafka at that stage?
Oh, yes.
I'm sure he would have. He went to Germany in 1922 to learn German and to study music.
Yeah.
So I think he would have been aware of Kafka probably in the original.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yes.
Anyone else?
Vote for Kafka.
I suppose then I'd like to just call on Brian Showers, who the only begetter of the Swan River Press, and he deserves a round of applause for this beautiful.
Thank you, first of all, everyone, for showing up tonight. We were standing here earlier and the room was empty, and you know that moment before the party where you don't know if anyone is going to show up, and then right at the last minute everyone floods in and it's a great party, and this feels as if it's been a really good party, and I'm just glad that everyone was here to share it. The reason I republished these novels is because they're novels that I love, and they're novels that I wanted other people to have the opportunity to read and share with others. Michael Durda, who wrote the introductions to the new editions, said buy 2 copies because you'll inevitably give one to you'll give your copy to a friend and they'll keep it, and you'll have to buy another copy anyways. And I think that's true. I've actually had people write emails to me and they've said, could I buy another copy because I loaned it to someone and they'd like to keep it. And it's wonderful to get emails and letters from people who are experiencing this novel for the first time. And just as I was leaving the house today, I got a postcard written on one of these from a fellow who a poet in California. His name is Donald Sidney Fryer, and I sent him a copy of Furzy, thinking he might enjoy it. And he wrote back, "I have too much to read, including stuff that I must. But in spite of myself, I'm already deep in Mr. Wall's remarkable and incredibly laugh-aloud funny novel, The Unfortunate Furzy. I have just met Father Furiosus. The delicious irreverence both remind me of the selected Averoyne Chronicles, which is Clark Ashton Smith's stories. And he writes here on the other side, he's written both ways. Too bad so many readers do not realize that you can be serious and funny at the same time." And I think that's true of a lot of Mr. Wall's work. It's hilarious, quite serious sometimes, but you'll never walk away without tears of laughter in your eyes. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'd like to thank our participants here. First of all, Mr. David Rowell, who did tremendous readings. Thank you. Maurice Harmon. Patricia and Rowell Mulkerns. Thank you. And I'm particularly grateful to Mr. Jonathan Williams, who has not only taken us through this evening, but also was instrumental in helping set up this evening and helping me get the new novels republished. So I'm very grateful to you for that. Thank you. Also, in that area over there are a number of members of the Wall family, and again, I'm very appreciative to you for your support and your generosity. They've loaned us tonight some personal effects on the table over here, which I strongly urge you to please have a look at. They were good enough to bring them out. So thank you very much. And you'll also notice the program that was on your seat when you came in was designed by Claire Brennan, who is Mr. Wall's granddaughter. And thank you, Claire. And I'd like to say that we're currently working on a new edition of A Flutter of Wings, which is Mervyn Wall's short story collection, and hopefully we'll have it out next year sometime. So keep an eye open for that. In addition to both of the Furzy novels, we have them in the front room there. There's also the 5th issue of the Green Book, which has a very lengthy interview with Mervyn Wall from the early 80s. I think it is 81, 82. So if you're interested in that, there's also that available. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and well, enjoy.